Sometimes with talks, I come up with a title because I have an idea, and then I fill in the content later. So that's what happened here, I'll be honest. But it's a bit of a stream of consciousness talk. I've got this kind of central idea. It's this thread, and we're going to pull at it. And it's going to take us in a meandering journey through the world of design. It starts with this theory, this idea that the developers, the ones who write the applications that use all these APIs we've been talking about this whole time, might actually be people. Now, I mean people in the sense of human beings. What I notice is that when I look at how a lot of design is done for APIs, it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. There's evidence that perhaps we're not designing for people, right? When we think of the developer, perhaps we're designing for some kind of stereotype or caricature. And that's what I want to investigate here. But to start with, I want to step back and talk about kind of design and the value of design for a little bit, so bear with me. And I want to do that with a story about me going to the bathroom in the CA office in London. So in London, which is where I'm from, by the way, we have a floor of a building. That's our office. Now, don't get me wrong, we have this palatial estate outside of London, but I'm in London, so I go to this office when I want to work. And it's pretty simple, right, the layout. You come out of the lifts, you turn left, you sit down at a desk and work. It's a bit simplified, but that's the basic idea. There comes a point in every person's life where they have to use the bathroom, and I got to that point. Now, this office was new to me, so I had to go and find this thing. And the amazing thing is that I was unable to do this. The first time I thought, I've just missed it. The second time I thought, there must be something wrong with me. Now, I want to assure you I'm not an idiot, right? And to prove that I'm not an idiot, when I actually asked someone, where is this toilet and how do I get to it? They tried to explain it. They tried to describe it, and then they stopped and gave up and actually walked me to the toilet. When we look at this view, it seems simple enough, right? You go through a few doors, and we reach our destination. So to understand why this was so challenging, we have to look at the door itself. If you've looked at design at all, if you've read any books, maybe you've read Don Norman, you know about Norman doors? The basic idea is that doors tell you how they work, and sometimes they lie to you. And here we have a handle that looks like a pull, but in fact it's a push. But if you remember, I'm not an idiot, and I've used hundreds of doors, thousands of doors. And what I've learned over time is that if a door doesn't open when you pull, you push, right? So it wasn't that. It wasn't the usability. It turned out that there was something else. The door was surrounded by all these signals or signifiers, these things. Where I'm from, up at the top, this means that's an exit. This means you use it if there's a fire, and this means you use this to put out the fire. Right? This is not a door that screams, go through me to find the toilet. You'd have to be an idiot to find the toilet through that door, right? And I'm not an idiot. And that's why someone had to walk me to this door and help me through. Now, amazingly, to add insult to injury, if you go through this thing and you don't have a pass, you're forever locked on the other side. This is a dangerous, dangerous design. What's shocking is when we look at the floor layout from that perspective, from the person who designed the office, it all seems perfectly logical. It's good design. But from the perspective of the user, the person who has to experience this, it's bad design. We often hear about user experience, usability. There's different ways to describe experience. Peter Morville, who was an information architect and then became a UX professional, has this way of describing it that's useful. He describes it as a honeycomb. And what's interesting is that usability is there, but it's not everything. So if we start applying this to our space, let's talk about APIs, right? There's two parts of Morville's honeycomb that are worth zooming in on. The first is value. You've heard that come up today a few times from a strategic perspective. Value to your business. You know, I think we have 10, 15 years of getting that lesson hammered in. And if it's new to you, you know, it's worth taking heed. We're getting pretty good at this, realizing that the work we do should be tied to some value. Then we have this idea of things being useful. If anything, services-oriented architecture and web services, primarily we're concerned with these aspects of design. Create value for business and provide functions to people who need to build applications, to provide useful functions. The real evolutionary step that we've taken so far seems to be to start addressing this part of the experience, to add usability to the equation. So now we don't just create a catalog of services arbitrarily. We don't simply expose data to the world. We expose data and services in a way that makes it usable, makes it easier for the application developer to create the application, to reduce the time to the first call, for example. But it's conceivable that in the future we could find ourselves going further. We could find ourselves going beyond usability now and addressing these other parts of the experience, at least as Morville describes. Things like findability. Things like credibility. You can create a highly usable API for a bank. But should that API look like the dynamic, agile, unstable API of a tech company? Maybe not, right? Maybe we need to start thinking about other aspects. Maybe we even need to think about things like desirability, the immediate emotional impact someone has when they use your interface based on the design decisions you made, the technologies you've chosen. To start looking at experience means to look at this thing as a whole, all of those decisions, all of the interactions, combining to create a lasting effect, an emotional impact. And the reason it's hard for us is because when we think about APIs, we start with boxes and lines. We've got a machine on the right. That's the API. And it's a big machine. And inside of it is databases and code and object models. And we turn the thing on. And then on the client side, we've got this other machine. And when we turn everything on and get it whirring, we get data coming from the big black box going into this smaller client machine. And what comes out, if we're lucky, is a user interface, right? That's how a lot of us are thinking about APIs. Now, the revolutionary or evolutionary step we've had is to think of it differently, because when we only think of the M-to-M interaction, when we only think about how machines talk to machines, we concern ourselves with these kinds of architectural properties, chattiness, scalability, latency, all these machine-specific things. But there's this whole host of other things that we're hearing about all the time: learnability, ease of use, documentation, right? And that's because we're acknowledging something. We're acknowledging that the interaction goes beyond this, that there's a human-computer interaction involved, that there's some developer. So what have we done? We've started to build tooling, documentation sites, portal sites, SDKs, plugins, to facilitate this interaction. And some of us are also realizing we can influence this interaction. Right? So there's these two human-computer interactions. By designing the API, by making those design decisions, and by designing these tools, I can create an experience. That's the basic idea, and this boils down to this thing that we keep getting told over and over. We're designing for developers now. We're not designing for the sake of it. We're not simply exposing. We're doing this for the developer. So who is the developer? What is it? What does it look like? One of the things about my job is I go to a lot of conferences, ones like this. I don't know how you people do it. I'm sick of it. But it's the job. Here's the other thing I've seen. Every conference I go to, someone tells me what a developer is. And the amazing thing is, a lot of times, those developers they describe can't be the same. I remember a conference we put on in London years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago maybe. We had an analyst come in, you know, a little bit different from Eric that you saw today. This analyst was a developer's developer. We brought him in to be that guy. Blue jeans, white t-shirt, they get a mustache, and he swore during the talk, right? He was that prototypical developer's developer evangelist. And he described what it takes to design a good API, and he had a lot of good things to say, smart things. And one of the things that stood out is he said, design your interface knowing that developers are lazy, right? So I nodded. I said, yeah, that makes sense, right? Design your interface in a way people don't have to work hard. Then we had a customer go up and talk about his experience building an API for some partners. And he'd done it for real, and he'd done a couple of iterations, and he knew what he was talking about. And he stood up and he said, do not design your API with the idea that developers are lazy, developers like to solve problems. So who's wrong and who's right? You know, it could be that what really happens is that we don't design for the same groups of people, that all developers aren't the same. If developers are people, and we follow that thread, it means that people are not the same, right? To prove that, we only need to look at a few things. But before we do that, let's talk about shortcuts. The reason we get ourselves into trouble sometimes is because we take shortcuts when doing design. One of them is we make assumptions. We make assumptions about the impact of our design decisions. SOAP is no longer popular. People don't like it. Hypermedia is too confusing. We often project our own experiences onto our users as well, right? I've been a developer for 15, 20 years. I know what people like to do when they use an API. Or we search out best practices. Maybe you came here today looking for that. 10 ways to improve your API, how to make an API that developers will love. Now, I want to be fair about this. You can build a good API taking these shortcuts. But what I want us to acknowledge is that that's what they are, right? You're making a trade-off here. When you take the shortcut approach, you're possibly building an API that's better suited for someone else's users. So I wanted to prove that people are in fact different. And usually what I do to prove that is talk about toilet paper. Now, here's 2 rolls of toilet paper. I don't know if you can see the details clearly, but they're hung in 2 slightly different ways. One has the sheet of paper hanging on the front, and the other on the back. It turns out that people usually prefer one way or the other. I'm not going to make value judgments about which one is correct, but I always like to get a little bit of feedback. How many people hang their roll this way? And how many people hang it the wrong way? At the back. Now explain yourself. He has kids. The answer I've heard before, too, is cats. So the answer is, if you hang your paper that way, it's less likely to get unfurled and unrolled. It highlights that from our own experiences, we can see this and think there's an obvious answer that everyone likes things a certain way, but it can turn out that based on people's own experiences, their own context, based on the goals, the tasks that they have to accomplish, they actually have different preferences. Here's the toilet paper question for developers. Which is the best IDE? Now, I've chosen 6. There's more than 6, of course. But here's 6. The reason I like talking about IDEs, especially for this experience stuff, is so much of, what we call developer experience stems from learnings that happened in this space. Microsoft, in their design and development of Visual Studio, spent a lot of time researching how developers interact with development tooling and started optimizing things with type aheads. And this became a very competitive space. Some of these tools are free, some cost money. There's a lot of variations. If we treated IDEs the way some of us treat API design, The logical conclusion would be whichever IDE is the furthest along in this evolution of usability is the one that we should all be using. But that doesn't turn out to be the case. One editor or IDE here particularly stands out for me, and that's up here in the top left, VI. Has anyone used VI? A couple of us, look how many. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say VI has poor usability. Here's how I'm going to prove this. If I took someone who's not used VI, and I start it, and I walk away, they will never figure out how to exit the program, ever. And yet, people still use this to develop programs. This is an old editing program. To be fair, it's its descendant, VIM, or Vim, that's used more commonly today, but it's the same basic idea. Why do you think people are still using VI or Vim to code? One theory might be that we're waiting for a set of 50-plus-year-old developers to retire, right? Is that the user base? It turns out to be false. That's not true. The user base for VI spans all kinds of age groups, all kinds of levels of experience, right? There's a lot of VI users. Is it then because it's kind of being institutionally taught, people are getting familiar with VI before they learn better tools, so it's familiar to them? You know, I think the answer really is that VI, for certain kinds of goals, can be the most efficient and optimal choice. If you are a user of VI and you actually learn all the shortcuts, the commands, you never really have to go to the mouse. You never really have to move your fingers. It's optimized for power users who are developers, right? So while something like a Visual Studio optimized for specific platforms with all kinds of learnability aids and usability aids is massively effective for experience, so is this. It turns out that there's not one type of person, one type of developer, or one type of user. One of the things I also like to look at is how technology is adopted. And the API space isn't very different. David Lytle came from that Xerox PARC world where everything that we will ever use, ever, came from. And Lytle identified that technology adoption goes through these discrete phases. An enthusiast phase, when something is brand new and people enjoy the experience of solving new problems with it. For enthusiasts, usability isn't really a feature. They like the problem-solving aspect of it, the ability to create something new, the challenge it presents. If enough enthusiasts use a new technology, it advances to the professional stage. At the professional stage, we start focusing on things like usability, on cost, right? Solving real problems at scale. When things reach a professional state, we start to think about standardization or putting interface controls in common places. And if we get enough professional adoption, we might enter a consumer phase where things start to get automated, where now the entire experience becomes massively important. So to see this apply to a technology we're familiar with, right, the PC presents an obvious example. The initial personal computers were definitely hobbyist projects. These were for enthusiasts. People would order it off the back of a magazine, put it together at home, and while they could solve computational problems, it was more about the experience of creating it. They didn't have to go and use a giant computer in an office. They were able to create something at home. And it was that experience that was pleasurable. Eventually, of course, we got to the professional state. And right away, we can see how different the interfaces are. At the enthusiast phase, we have all these different hobbyist kits. By the time we reach the professional phase, there's a lot of IBM PC and IBM PC clones, more standardization, more common controls and interfaces. And there's lots of examples we could use for the consumer phase. The one I like to use is the gaming PC. There you have a computer that, while it provides all the usability and usefulness you'd expect, right? It has the processing power and the memory power for you to play video games. It also allows the person who buys this to say something about themselves to the world, right? It has a see-through screen. The case is beautifully designed. It shows everyone that you really care about games. So what if we apply the same kind of thinking to the web API space at a macro level? And I think this is very debatable, right? You could come up with your own 3 phases easily, but to make my point, we'll use mine. At the enthusiast level, I'd argue, the beginnings of the World Wide Web are the enthusiast level of web APIs. Matt touched on that. This idea of the browser coming into being. This is, Tim Berners-Lee and academics playing with the World Wide Web in its infancy, writing browser clients, writing web servers. Eventually, of course, we enter into a professional era that lasts for quite a while, I think culminating with the services-oriented architecture and web services, standardizing on controls and interfaces. I theorize that we might be entering into a consumerist phase today and in the future. I don't know what exactly it will look like, but we're starting to see increased adoption of client applications using APIs. Hopefully improved automation. We're seeing platforms like If This Then That lower the bar, the cost of entry, right, for developers. And as we move towards this type of phase, this is when UX, the all-encompassing experience, becomes a difference maker. Suddenly, we need to start caring about all those other aspects. So this is what it fundamentally comes down to. If you want to improve the user experience for your APIs, if you care about this, you do need to design for people, not the caricature of what a developer is, right? Not the sketch, but you actually need to start figuring out who your users are. And there's 3 reasonable ways to do that, 3 low-budget ways. First thing is you can invite users into the room, like literally. If you're creating an API for mobile developers in your partner company or in your company, you can actually bring them in during the design phase. Find out how the design decisions affect the type of work they need to do. Get immediate feedback on how that interface will feel for them. In the Nordics, they actually have this whole thing called participatory design. It's a democratic design concept, right? That if, let's say you're designing city streets, the citizens who have to live on those streets should be part of the design process, part of the decision-making process. Same idea. It's easier to do when you're talking about private and partner APIs, to be honest. If it's public APIs, this kind of exercise can be a bit more expensive, but might be worth doing. The important thing to consider if you do this is that you want users not to dictate what the design is. They're going to participate, right? Otherwise, we don't really need you. We could just have them design their own APIs. The second thing you can do is change your perspective. We tend to design products, interfaces, pretty much anything with a mental model, right? That reflects all the complexity, all the internal stuff we know. An easy and cheap way to combat that is to get out and learn about users. So you're here at an API conference, I assume because you work in the API space. But it might be useful to go to mobile developer conferences or web developer conferences or wherever the users are of your APIs. Start to find out what problems, challenges they have, what their world looks like. Another easy thing you can do is conduct interviews, which sounds intimidating and sounds expensive. It doesn't have to be. I've had a lot of success just having 5 people that I call who I know do development to build applications that are similar to the kind of applications we might want to attract. Just come up with 5 or 6 questions. Call a few people, get some answers, have a discussion, have a conversation. You can do that in half a day, and you'll get enormous benefit from it. It might turn out that you simply validate assumptions you already had. It might turn out that you challenge them, that you learn something you really didn't know. And the last thing you want to do is make feedback easy. So if you have testers, evangelists, beta users, all of that, make it easy for them to feedback on what works and what doesn't. Ultimately, you want to have empathy. This is what it's really about. You can make the happiness of your application developers, a design goal here. It doesn't just have to be, we want an application that's easy to deploy, that performs well. When you're making your decisions, think about the poor slob who has to write the application user interface. We never used to, right? I don't remember ever caring about that when doing web services. But in this new space, if you want to be competitive, if you want optimized and efficient applications, that's what you have to do. Joshua Block, in this great talk about API design, suggests writing client code. And I think this single piece of advice, if you take nothing else away, can fundamentally change your whole design process. To actually put yourself in that app dev shoes and write code for your interface will give you that level of empathy you need. And ultimately, design for a person. Right? Use personas, use user stories, whatever it takes to really embrace the idea that you're not just designing for a machine, but for a developer who has to write client code. That title, I don't know how many people got the reference in the title. It's actually a Philip K. Dick novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was adapted into a film called Blade Runner. A central theme in that story is that what separates humans from machines is empathy. And I think that's what we really need to do, right? We're no longer in that design era of simply providing services for applications to use. I want you to always design with this tenet of empathy. I want you to embrace that idea and always design for real people. All right, that's my time. Thank you.